using the payette as kind of a reference, because I live in McCall, I've traveled to a lot of stuff on the Nez Perce, and I've traveled to a lot of stuff on Boise. And you can even break out by forest the management styles that different people were using and the needs based on the landscape and geography. For instance, on the Payette, there's a lot of remote land there. 800,000 acres or so was part of the original primitive area that was formed in 1931, which is now main part of what is now the Frank Church Wilderness. Those are very basic designs that they did in the 1930s. They took those camps, made them very basic, so it's all pier and post, mainly L4 type stuff is what they were building. It was easy to get there as far as pack and get to the sites. You go up to the Nez Perce, in contrast, a lot of native material. They relied a lot more on logs, very beautiful dovetail corner finish work. And then when you go down to the Boise National Forest, they also used L4s, but they would always build really nice concrete basements. They always used, very common to use garages for like an automobile because they had road access there. A lot more logging, a lot more roads that existed. So you kind of see that those distinguishing features there. I also got interested in things that made them unique over time. And so a pattern of that were the alligators. These are from Ray's collection, you know, the evolution of the alligator. I love the one with the site that he had in 1915. Incredible collection. I never did find any of those on the Payette. This is a 1917 Osborne, which is the really cool one where you can actually draw the fire based on what you're finding. I did confirm a couple of those on the Payette when I was doing that project. And then the most famous one that we see around the Northwest is the 34 Osborne version. And I had discovered some, you know, there's all kinds of variations within those as well. And then, of course, in Idaho, a very unique one to us is the Bosworth Firefinder, a very unique site, very heavy and big. And I've determined there were at least 2 of those used on the Payette. To my knowledge, there's an active one, I think, on pilots. Yep, okay, somebody else knew that. On Nez Perce, it's still being used. Communications all started out as heliograph work, and how do we refine that? The number 9 telephone system was developed. I like this picture because it has the combination of both. But are there any crazy stories out there? And I did find one. This was he was a forest ranger on the old Idaho National Forest, so Walt SF. And he attempted to use carrier pigeons in 1922. And he claimed it was successful. He wrote the regional office in Ogden in 1923 and said, we didn't lose a single bird. Now, the rumor on the forest is that there were lots of hungry lookouts. So, I don't know. Another thing was the evolution of the insulators that we all see along the trails everywhere. So when I was at the Forest Service, and this is common with a lot of places, they were doing a purge. They were getting rid of a lot of the old manuals and those kind of things because they weren't going to store them, or they would scan them and dump them. And so I found a couple really neat old the telephone manuals, and I found this great excerpt where it explained the evolution of this. So that the far left one over there was a very round one, and those are the very first ones. If you see those are a very early style. The problem was the number 9 wire would catch them and break. And so then they went to the oblong version so that the wire moved down lower when it was strung, and they didn't break in the where they would join them. It wouldn't break anymore. Only problem is these were a real issue with marksmen. They had a lot of hunters out there that liked to shoot them, and so they got rid of them and then went to the all brown version that we most of the time see nowadays. So just a funny little anecdote that you find reading those old manuals again. Another thing I found, everybody's familiar with lightning stools, with the glass-footed stools on fire lookouts. I always thought they were so neat. I've always thought, you know, I tried to always take pictures of them when I would visit lookouts to see all the different versions. Well, I'm looking through these telephone manuals, and like a lot of places, like, for example, a lot of people have talked about Graves Peak today. You can see up there getting material, all rock, very hard to get material up there. You didn't want to waste anything. And so the idea was they used, like the L4 kits, they standardized, they had standardized designs for the stools that they would do. This is a very early version, 1930. The only one I've ever actually seen. It hits just the exact measurements that came from the phone manual. Ignore the kid, they're all over my house. I love footstools. This is the more common one I've ever seen. This is from about a 1935 manual. You see quite a few of these around. And then, of course, the unique. Aero motors are not rare in most parts of the United States, but they are more so out west. The Payette had 8 of them at one time, 2 different manufacturers. I got interested in those, kind of looking at the different styles. This is Carrion here on the right. It's the only one that is still active on that forest. Swift Creek, that was one that inspired me from the very beginning, where my friend Claude Avery had been a lookout in 1934. It has since been removed. Elk Summit, and this one's Bear Valley at the headwaters of the Middle Fork. And of course, you know, how do they get into the sites? Moving an aero motor is quite impressive to get into a site. This is a Chamberlain Basin, about 1936, and here they are packing it up out to Arctic Point. The Arctic Point is still standing. It's listed on the National Historic Register. To my knowledge, it is the only aero motor that is in a wilderness area. Here's another one that was a sister one out in the Frank Church Wilderness, and this is them taking it down in 1974. They pack it out, take it to the Chamberlain Airfield, and fly it out. And I also took an interest in aero motors. About this time, when I finished college, I talked my parents into putting one up on a property that they own. And this is one that I restored. It's a 1936 that came from Cold Mountain, which is out also in the Frank Church Wilderness. They broke it down in 1994, donated it to a local museum. And I switched the museum. I put one up there, and I was able to get one of these for free, but it was a huge project. This one's only up on 15 feet, and my goal was to restore it to about how it looked in 1940, right down to all the different little fittings are all authentic to that period. And there's another lookout inside the cabin. The Payette is also known for what I call gold-based lookouts, very unique lookouts. And I'm going to talk about those. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit, but I'll get into those. And then unique. You know, we talk a lot about people that are on fire lookouts. A lot of famous writers have been on lookouts. But I was curious, was there anybody that had been overlooked? And I found actually this was my tower that was on its original site. And it did have what I turned out to be a fairly famous fire lookout that was there one season. He ended up going on to genetically modify wheat. Most wheat that we eat came from this guy's lab. Popular with some, not popular with others as far as GMO foods. Yeah. He became the father of the Green Revolution, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, and he was a fire lookout in Idaho. And of course, lookouts that have been removed. We can learn a lot from these places. A lot of people don't necessarily like to go to the lookouts that no longer have the structures. But I always found it from an archaeology standpoint that you could learn a lot from what was left behind, a lot of the little pieces and fittings that were period correct to those spots. I always thought it was very interesting. And also when we're doing work for the Forest Service, we often take pieces to go restore another lookout site. So I always thought those were kind of interesting. That's Bear Wallow up there on the Nez Perce. This is one of the gold lace lookouts, which I'll talk about here in a minute. That's Forest Mountain on the upper right. I was talking about that one. That's when they burned it in 1979, 1980, right in there. And then this is King Point, which is out on the rim of Hell's Canyon. So that was my fire lookout project. And then I got really into backcountry aviation. I flew for a number of years as a commercial pilot for a living. And one of my first jobs was working out of McCall for an air charter company. And I was very interested in all these places. Nobody had written a complete history of all the airstrips. And there's a lot of them. Idaho has more airstrips, designated airstrips, I have to use the word carefully, than anywhere else in the United States, more so than Alaska and Canada, believe it. And the key term is they're designated. You know, there's a lot of off-site landing that goes on in Canada and Alaska. But Idaho certainly has its own mecca in history of aviation. And of course, a lot of aviation ties into fire lookouts. And I think there was somebody else in kind of discussion on this that I saw over here, but they experimented with dropping timbers for fire lookouts. And I called Bill Moore ahead of time to see if he's told me this wonderful story. And he can do a lot better job than I can. So would you share your dad's story of this? I'll just
I've never seen that newspaper article, but I'll tell you what pretty much what happened.
Yeah.
Pop ordered a new lookout for Bear Mountain. And in those days you ordered it from, I think either Columbia Falls or in, Spokane, and then places ordered. So you'd order a kit. So a ranger could call in and say, I want a 53-foot tower and an L4 on top of it, and I want a road tower or a backcountry tower. And that's all they had to say. They come in the kit. So Bob ordered one from Bear Mountain in a cave. He had ordered a backcountry tower, but they sent a road tower. When I'm talking to Forest Service folks, I'll say that PO went to Albuquerque, road towers are on sale, so that's what we saw. But when it got to Missoula, Pop wouldn't take it. He said, that's not what I ordered. I got no way to get it up there. And it kind of was a stalemate. So the board supervisor, I think his name was Myrick, called into the Powell and said, you know, can you come up with something? We're arguing with the railroad and the vendor and blah, blah. So Pop went out to the Jumper Center and Johnson Flying Service and asked them if they could fly it in the tower. The cab was no problem. It was the road tower legs are longer, much longer that they couldn't back them up there with vacuums. So they talked about it and they decided they could. So they got a DC-3. I didn't realize this until I was looking at this Montana the other day. But there's a door in the back that you can open for throwing cargo out and stuff. And so they put the logs or the legs in there, had them hanging out that door in the back, and they flew up to Bear Mountain. Bob Johnson flew it personally through that plane. And they said that he flew over and had Bob show him where he hoped those would go. The plane was a jump plane, so it had lighting system in it. And he said, when I'll fly back about where you're at, and then when I give you the green light, change it from red to green, I'll bank a little bit and you push it out the door. So that's what they did. They'd fly over and the green light would come on and the cruiser guy in the back would shove one bundle out the door. Then they'd get to the door as quick as they could with their notebooks and write down where it went. They did all four of the lookout, all four sets of legs, got them out. They said they had one and something went a little wrong with the shoe, and it came down and it slid on his nose, skipping kind of down. But they knew where it was, so they got them all. And all they had was one leg had bundled on it, a couple of bent 2x4s. They got broken. But they could get them up there, they won't do that. That's in essence the story of the thing. An interesting sideline, if you don't mind me going a little farther, is the Bear Mountain sits right up above Jerry Johnson Hot Springs. I mean, and it's not in the wilderness anymore, it sticks out with the trails all over this. But in those days, the road ended at Powell. It was 10 miles basically from Powell down to the mouth of Warm Springs Creek, and then another 8 up to the lookout. So that was a pretty long pack trip for all the rest of the stuff. But straight across from Bear Mountain is Jerry Johnson Lookout. It's no longer there, but and then the old Lowell motorway went down the old CCC road went down the top of the ridge, clear down to the so down the river. And so they took the lookout was a couple, and so they hired a wife to do their cooking, and they set up a camp up at Jerry Johnson Lookout, had 2 back strings, trucked the cab and all the pieces down there, and they'd run down off of Jerry Johnson, which was about 3 miles down to the Locksaw and then up to Bear Mountain, and that made their track trip a lot shorter. And that's what they did. In those days, Jerry Johnson didn't have, wasn't a hippie attracted or whatever. There was a little cabin there that guys tried to build, but they never finished it. So the Packers took a piece of pipe down with them and they jury rigged it in the hot spring so it would run out, and they'd go down and they had a 9-mile packer, and then they had Lenny Smith, who was the Powell packer. They'd make a run off of Jerry Johnson down up to Bear, come down. By then the animal critters are pretty tired and they're easy to handle. They just tie up, lead the horse off to a tree and have a shower, and then go on back up to Jerry Johnson and repeat it to the next day. Because there was no US 12. That's the story.
Well, thank you, Bill. So better than I could tell you. Well, this was so successful, and for those of you who don't know, Bob Johnson ran Johnson Flying Service. They had a branch in Missoula and in McCall. They were the largest operator to ever operate commercially in the backcountry, and they did all kinds of really neat stuff and everything. That was so successful that they did it again at Bear Wallow in 1955, and then they did it again at Bailey Mountain. And this is a very hard book to find. If anybody can find it, Don McCollum wrote a wonderful story about pulling all the timbers that they dropped for the Bear Wallow. You can never find a copy of it. Here's Bailey Mountain. Right up there, there's the old lookout. And this is one of the things I love most about writing books is you get a book done and then it gets out there. And in this case, the U of I had written an article about my book and it reached a lot of people that I never could reach. And this guy reached out to me and he said, "Hey, my name's Larry Smith. I worked on all these lookouts from 1948 to 1960 or whatever." And we started communicating and he would write little stories for me. And so I shared them with Cindy, who's the archaeologist on the Nesverse. He had some really cool stuff, including these pictures. And that's how I learned about this Bailey Mountain. And here you can see the old lookout and then all the timbers that they dropped up there at the top. Another connection with aviation and fire lookouts are the numbering system. And when I first got into fire lookouts and wrote my first book, I contacted Gary Weber and I said, "Hey, what can you tell me about this?" And he shared what he knew, and Dave Buell shared what he knew. And I started going around and collecting aeronautical charts to see if I could figure it out. Well, we only got so far. I asked Gary last night, "Hey, have you found anything more on this?" And he hasn't. But this is again my lookout. And I interviewed that guy. He was there in 1940, and that's 17, the number on it. It's 72 feet tall. Just a little plank out there that he's up there stenciling the number on. But there was obviously a numbering system prior to pre-World War II, at least in Idaho, and then one that was put in place after World War II. That's what you see most common on charts. It lasted into about the mid-1980s, late 80s. They maintained the numbers. To my knowledge, it's no longer a system anymore. You can see the aeronautical chart with all the little numbers. Now, the joke among aviators is that if you're relying on that, you're in trouble. So, but it would help in a case if you needed a reference. Great reference points for aviators out there with fire lookouts. And when they disappear, it's of course a lot harder to know. This is another example of this is sheep leader out in the French church. And another connection with aviation and fire lookouts was just the occasional aviator that liked to drop something, newspapers, mail, and of course, ice cream was very popular to drop on airplanes. And then came in this whole thing with helicopters and fire lookouts in about late 1950s, early 1960s. Most lookouts that were still active got a heliport. These are some pictures I just wanted to show that were taken by Rod Snyder. He's an old friend of mine. He ended up being the rescue pilot on Higgins Ridge. If anybody's seen that Montana PBS episode, but he took some fabulous pictures. He showed me so many pictures of his helicopters with fire lookouts. And I'd say, "Well, Rod, do you know where that is?" No idea. So he's got a lot of pretty pictures, but he doesn't know where they are. The next book I wrote was a continuation of my second book, Backcountry Aviation. And this one covered the area of Hell's Canyon, both the Oregon and Idaho side, as well as the lower Maine salmon and over into the Wallows. Unexpectedly, I ran into some more fire lookout history. This is, I should back up, this is the Meadows airstrip, which is just right on the rim of Hell's Canyon. And then this is a Hat Point lookout that you're looking at. This is over in Oregon. And that's Hat Point. It's a really cool lookout. A lot of Indian artifact stuff that went on there at the base of it, and that's looking over into the Idaho side of the Seven Devils. And then Bert Zimmerly, he was also a very famous aviator. He flew out of Lewiston, probably just as famous as Bob Johnson. And this is a story I ran across of him doing a rescue up at Horse Heaven Lookout on the south side, so on the Idaho side, on the south end of the Seven Devils. Somewhere in 1939, the lookout there found several tick bites on himself, along with several ticks. He got very sick, And he called his boss. They came up there. The ranger came up there, and they tried to move him, but he was too ill. And it's a 15-mile pack trip to get to the nearest road, which it still is. You go up to this site. And so they started to call around. And they called Bert and said, "Hey, do you think you could land an airplane up there on the meadow?" And he had the pod. And he said, "I think I can." And so he took a Traveler, which is not a Cub. It's a pretty big airplane for what he was trying to do. And this spot right here, he landed on in the summer of 1939 and rescued the fire lookout and flew to Lewiston. That's Bert and his wife. There's the cabin with the original tower. This is a modern day photo that I took. And you can see about the spot he landed. The cabin is still there. The tower's gone, but the cabin is still there. And that's about the spot he landed on. And it's quite impressive. It's about 8,200 feet above sea level and about 1,000 foot long. I measured it out, and about 12% slope. And there you can see the little cabin. It's pretty impressive. And then I just left Buckskin Bill up here from the previous thing I did, but it's amazing how many people were lookouts. And you start researching somebody in the Idaho backcountry, and they were a fire lookout, a very common job in the day that they would take during the summer. In Hells Canyon, there was this old copper miner that was a fire lookout on sourdough lookout on the Nez Perce. And quite a funny story of these guys, but I'm sure most people are familiar with Buckskin Bill on the Salmon River at 5 Mile Bar. He was a lookout at Oregon Butte. But my next project, I had run across Harry Shelworth's name. And no surprise, we're going to have Ray Kressick's name again. I'm going to do it one more time after this. I first read about Harry Shelworth in Ray's book. And what made Harry known in at least the lookout world was he started, now there's an argument about who's first or not first, but he was a big proponent of TPAs, Timber Protective Associations. And he was the official founder of the Southern Idaho Timber Protective Association, but he did a lot of the lobbying work for the other TPAs in Idaho. And it became the Idaho idea. Idaho was kind of the first group that wanted to protect private lands, and they co-opt their resources together instead of Forest Service stuff. So very front country type stuff around urban areas, and wanted to protect obviously their timber resources. Harry is a fascinating character. I got talked into this book by their family, and so I did this book partially for their family, but I had a lot of interest in him because he had a lot of activity in McCall as well as the Idaho Perimeter. But he worked for the Boise Bay Lumber Company, which was a subsidiary of Weyerhaeuser. And I'll explain a little more why that's so interesting. But he was their land agent, so he would go out and buy prospective timberland. Most of that land nowadays, most recently ended up in potlatch, and a lot of that has now ended up in, people have heard of DF development. The Wilkes brothers have ended up with a lot of that land that Harry helped originate to get initially. Of course, if you want to protect your timber resources, you have fire lookouts. Harry had 7 different lookouts built for the Southern Idaho Protective Association. These are early versions up on Brundage Mountain. You can still see the original site, and that cabin is still standing at the top of Brundage Mountain Resort. Harry wanted to make sure he was a competitive guy, very gregarious, and he was a lobbyist. I always say he was not a politician. But he always, I could read through a lot of his letters, things that are at the Idaho State Historical Site, but he loved to jab back and forth with the other TPAs. My liquids are always going to be the finest, the best. They're going to be better than the Forest Service. And he took a lot of pride in that. He also used them as a political tool to get sway of votes and things for the timber industry. This is a picture of William Bora with Harry up at Schaefer Butte, which is now Bogus Basin ski area. Harry is with a whole bunch of foresters. He'd have meetings at fire lookouts. He thought it was really important to show people what fire lookouts did, the importance of forestry. He'd give all these talks as they drove up, and it was this kind of a big show he put on. Another one of Schaefer Butte, Brundage. And what really catapulted Harry and his fire lookouts was in 1933, he went back to Washington and lobbied on the state's behalf, and he got the most civilian conservation corps camps west of the Mississippi other than the state of California. He was a very powerful lobbyist, and as a result of that, as a thank you, they appointed him, and it should say one of many, but he was appointed a coordinator of the Southern Idaho portion of the CCC. And with that, he got to set up the camps, different camps that he was in charge of, and they were, no surprise, set up very close to where he wanted fire weapons set up. And so he got some of the finest craftsmen to build his second generation of fire weapons. So he replaced all the early ones and put them on in the mid-30s. And he had the finest lookouts that I've ever seen built. And he called them gold lace, meaning very fancy. They were fancy in architecture. They were very different in craftsmanship. He used a lot of the local builders to build really nice things. You just look at the size of the shutter. These were all open with skeleton keys, very elaborate. And he liked to have the names to be something different. So, like when he established the one on what is now called No Business, it had a generic name that could be on any forest. And he said, "Oh, we've got to come up with this name." So he interviewed a local sheep herder who had been operating there for centuries, and he told this story about how a bear got into camp and how nobody has any business being up there. So no business. People will remember that. So he renames it. The other thing he does is he paints these initially all silver. And the reason to paint them silver is that when people were driving on the highways, like Highway 55, Highway 95, they'd see it, and they would be curious, and they'd want to go up and look. And when she got up there, you get a spiel all about forestry, right? And so that was his thing. And these are some of the lookouts, very fancy, ornate lookout structures. And that one's No Business. So No Business is the only one left. A lot of people argue that it's kind of a replica of sorts. This picture is not a modern one. But if you go there nowadays, these are all saddle notch logs that were replaced down here. I should say D logs that were replaced down here. And the only original part is the cab. But it's the only one that's left. It's got this unique halo grounding system that he would put on them. But also what makes it so unique is that they have full living quarters in the bottom. These are modern day photographs. It's still very intact. Sadly, Southern Idaho Timber, they have two lookouts left. They have one at Brundage, which was replaced in 1980, and then they have this one. They have decided to no longer staff them, and there's a lot of question about the fate of what's going to happen to No Business. It's not been manned for 2 years, but it's a very unique place. Brundage, I thought this was amazing. I raised books all full of these great little quips and quotes. And I remember the first time I read this, it said, Brundage has a what? And you read the article and it's got a piano. Now, what I did, I got to find a picture of the piano. So I tracked down the Taylors, who were some of the Taylors' kids that had been lookouts there for 20 plus years. They were lookouts during the summer, but they were music professors at a university. And so they always they had a piano up there for years, and you can see a picture of it there. Again, very entertaining out there, full China sets, tea sets. This is a press deal that he wanted everybody to agree to back his bill, and he wouldn't let them leave the lookout, so he brought them lunch and dinner before they left until they would agree to back it. He also used them as a great entertainment. So in 1938, 39, 40, right in that period, a movie was shot in McCall called Northwest Passage. It's famous at the time, kind of has gone with the wind now. These are some of the movie stars and the local timber people that he's entertaining at the headquarters there. He took them all to fire lookouts, and to this day, if you go into the museum there in McCall, you can see some very famous movie stars that signed the ledger and No Business. And here's the reason that Harry's so interesting, is that he's an oxymoron. Harry is this big land grab guy for Weyerhaeuser, but where does he want to spend all his free time? In the Idaho primitive area, what was to become the Idaho primitive area. He liked to go out on the Middle Fork of the Salmon River, particularly pack trains. He was a big trophy hunter. He liked to fish. Spent a lot of time on Big Creek. His personal guide that he was very close with was Dave Lewis. The University of Idaho now owns the Dave Lewis property, which is the Taylor Ranch. So in 1920s, he started to notice that there was an infiltration of people. I imagine this in the 20s. That they were infringing on his hunting area. And it even became more so prominent as airstrips started to be built around 1930, late 1920s. They were doing aerial patrols out of Spokane that came down into this area. And he saw that as a huge threat to his hunting area. So in 1927, he puts together a trip. Very influential people go on this trip. Governors, senators, all these people. This is a picture of the Middle Fork with Big Creek coming in on the bottom of it. Took many years ago. And Harry is the guy that comes up with the idea of the Idaho primitive area. It's the first primitive area established in the state of Idaho in 1931. It's a little over 1 million acres. It's mainly the chunk of what makes up the present day Frank Church River No Return Wilderness. Here he is on Lower Rush Street. Harry's the guy in the hat. You can't quite see him. This is Dave Lewis. Most of these people get appointed to be the steering committee on whether they're going to create the primitive area. And of course, they vote for it. And it becomes established. Harry's very proud of it. He does several more pack trips throughout his years until he gets elderly in the 50s. He can't do it. But he had, this just shows you how gregarious this guy was. He took the Weyerhaeusers on trips out there. All those people from the East, that when he wanted to influence them back in Washington, when he went back there, they would have this connection to it, right? Oh, yeah, that's the most beautiful place in the world. And you can see how it would work. But in order to get these Easterners, many of them who had never camped before, he would print their names on these little pouches. And he'd either send them to them in advance, or when he met them at the train station, wherever that would be, he'd gather them around or at a trailhead and he'd hand these out with their little name on it. He said, "You're initiated in the group. You are now an official Idaho primitive area depositor." And what this is for your toilet paper. And he thought that was the funniest thing in the world. So that's what he handed out. Well, that's the one that they have with the store. He was also into auto tours. So when he got a little bit older in age, couldn't do the pack trips, or if he had somebody he wanted to do but couldn't take, they wouldn't have the time to go for 2 weeks at a time to go. He would do auto tours, and this is kind of one that connects to a fire lookout. In the 30s, when they were building Sun Valley Resort, the Harrimans all came out to look at the progress of it, and they hired Harry as a tour guide to take them up to Stanley Basin. And he rented out the Rocky Mountain Lodge and showed him, Redfish Lake and all these beautiful places in Idaho. But he knew there wouldn't be time to get to his primitive area. And so he found the nearest lookout that they could look into. That is Baffin Creek Point. And here they are right up at the summit. This lookout is no longer there. The foundations are there. Indian Point is just north of here, and that's a pretty well-known fire lookout that's still right in this area. But here's Harry with a cigarette and a bunch of the Harrimans and noteworthy people of the Union Pacific Railroad. Okay, it brings me to my last book project. This one took me 8 years to complete. It's a very tragic story, a very heavy story. It's about an airplane that departed Grangeville in 1979 with a crew of Forest Service people on it bound for Moose Creek. They lost both engines and crashed into the Selway River. What made it famous, well known, is that there was a backpacker on the river that day who actually was able to capture the right engine falling off the airplane that made headlines across the U.S. The next day. How it ties to lookouts. I was surprised at how many lookout connections actually ended up in this book. The first one is one of the passengers who lost their lives was the lookout to be on Shister Peak. She was there with her dog. The dog ended up surviving. Some smoke jumpers rescued it, and it went on to, it had a broken leg and was taken to Grangeville. But there's several other little connections. When I started visiting with a lot of folks from the Moose Creek district of this era, some pictures here. This is Gardner Peak, and there's Great Peak, and this is an old one of Sheer Peak. Shistler's down there at the bottom, and of course, Wiley's Peak. Shortly after that accident, there was a major fire, and it's a historic fire in Idaho, at least, called the Independence Fire. And this is Ralph Fire. He was the lookout at Gardner Peak that summer. On July 4th, he got up. He got a second day on the lookout. They had a big lightning storm come through, and he had several lightning strikes that went into the Bear Creek drainage, which is a major tributary to the Selway River, right up where near where the West Fork Ranger District on the Bitterroot is, and the Moose Creek on the Nesfers meet there on the upper end of the river. He saw the fire. He initially got it on the wrong side. The fire patrol came out the next day. They got it marked. And it was the first time on the Moose Creek Ranger District that they were going to let it burn. They had done a big fire inventory study the years leading up to it. And of course, on the West Fork Ranger District, they had the Whitecap fire, which was the first one in that area that they allowed to burn or prescribed to burn. Next, very controversial at the time. It started out to be, not a big problem, and then the fire started to grow pretty heavily, burning down the Bear Creek District. They did have outlined in their fire management policy that they would protect in-holdings and private facilities as well, certain fire lookouts that they had marked, as well as bridges that they had earmarked that they would protect. And so here you've got a ranger district that's had this major tragedy happen with a lot of folks that are grieving. They don't have a lot of the resources that they had in those days, or that we have in today's world, I should say. And so the ranger, Art Siemens, had a great quote, and he said, if it hadn't been for that fire, we wouldn't have had all this energy to focus elsewhere that really helped them grieve through this process. It was something that they could all work on and get together. So a lot of the Moose Creek crews worked on the bridge protection. You can see that they had some leniencies in 1979. They're in the wilderness area. They're using power equipment. See that in the photographs. The fire, like I mentioned, did get a little out of hand. It went, or I shouldn't say out of hand, but it went places they didn't expect it to, and it jumped the Selway River, which there's a lodge there called Selway Lodge. And so they ended up having to do a back burn, and you can see the torches on the bottom side there. And then the back burn ended up working. Some of the smoke jumpers that were on the rescue of the airplane crash were also involved with these fires. And so they came back into the Selway again on this fire. And here's Art Siemens and Larry Cowan. Interesting, he was a U of I grad student at the time, and he was writing the fireman, and he had written fire management policy. So then I interviewed him. I think he actually got to see his study work, which was pretty interesting. They about got into trouble as far as the reputation to the media. They got a call that said, "Hey, this thing's getting pretty heavy. Figure out a way to put it out." And that next day, they had a major storm come through and it put it out. So it turned out to be a successful let it burn first policy that they did. One interesting thing, one thing I love about the backcountry is there's all these things that interweave. You find all these different connections with things. And where they set up their fire camp with the Independence Fire in 1979 was the site of the original Bear Creek Ranger Station. And being lookout buffs, I'm sure probably everybody in this room or darn near close to it has read A River Runs Through It. And one of the essays that's in that book is USFS 1919, where Norman talks a lot about Holmes from his years at Graves Peak before they had the actual lookout there that he was running off at Elk Summit. But that's a merging of his summer of 1918 and 1919. In 1918, this is where he was based out of. And it was this exact spot where they had the Independence Fire in 1979. And here's what it looked. This is probably in the 30s before they moved some of the buildings upstream to shoot. Let's see. That's about all I've got. I've covered a lot of ground there. I just was making connections with my different projects that I've worked on where fire lookouts kind of integrated in. So, does anybody have any questions? Michael? Sure.
Okay, you talked about, I want to go back to the Harry shower. You mentioned this contradiction in kind of this contained within this character.
Yeah.
And I know you guys talked about something about being wilderness theory, and I was thinking about how there's an inherent contradiction built into wilderness in itself, right? So is it once a place that's supposed to sort of be where the human presence, and yet it's a place where there are always been it's history within wilderness areas. They are wilderness itself with a human construct, right? So it's not about right? So stuff it's still susceptible to the evil forces, that exert itself against non-religious areas in my border. What I'm trying to get is, the fire of itself seems to be completely contradictions, right? The heat solitude and love getting to the grid, and all these things. And I just wondered, do these contradictions work themselves into your work often? Like, you ever find yourself thinking, like, what even is a lookout? Metaphysically, philosophically, what even is this place, right? You never get confused by that when you're writing?
I don't know if I can get on your level, Michael. I like it, but I'm so much more of just I'm a literist almost. I know what you're trying to say, and I do think that lookouts have a place in wilderness as part of the history and the character of the landscape and how we understand it and modern history and all those things. But it's a good question. It's a really good question.
It's like they're being structured inside of the wilderness area, right? So, characters surround with us, they're contradictory to some of the very ideas that they hold years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I guess that's what I mean. It's like, how often is that?
Well, I will tell you on the Payette National Forest, there was a manager there who had started out at Moose Creek. And Moose Creek, I talk about this some in my book, was known as the place where a lot of the boots on the ground type wilderness ethics, how you actually apply it happens. So they brought back the crosscut saw, they brought back a lot of hand tools, like basically taught people where it all started. And this one manager from the Payette, that's where he started, was Moose Creek. Well, he ended up the head of managing the wilderness part of the Payette National Forest. And he was very against structures. He was very much a purist, is what I would call it. Now, he told me once, he said, yeah, it's fine to leave them. And he was known to get rid of them. But it's fine to leave them. And he used the example of Chicopee, which you've been to. And he said, I love to see it just kind of fall down and change with the landscape and gray. And, that's great, but ultimately it won't be there anymore. And that's how it should be. And that's how he viewed it. So I guess it just kind of depends. I don't really have an opinion. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks. Yes.
One of the words in your title is research.
Yes.
So how do you do your research?
Well, I do a lot of libraries, special collections. And I will say the last book, I've got to give Cindy behind you a big round of applause because without her help, I couldn't have done the last book. She was able, she not only, allowed me to get archives that maybe a lot of people wouldn't have access to at the Forest Service, but since her dad had been the ranger on that district, he had a lot of those files. And so when he passed away, she found those and shared those with me. So I was able to pull off a lot of primary documents. That's what I really like to use. Also in the last book, I was fortunate enough to get several people that were involved with that accident. They had kept, I'm not actually sure the Forest Service, maybe somebody in this room could probably answer that. Forest Service people used to always keep a little log, a daily diary every day. Still do, okay. And so several of those people had saved those from 1979 and they let me borrow those. And so I was able to recreate a lot of sequence of events. But as much as I can, I use primary documents. And I also like the oral side of it because that's what pulls the reader along is the story. So that's what I like to use. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. It's in McCall. And it's off of Lick Creek Road. It's at a private house. Yeah, it would be very hard to find. It would be very hard to find. Yeah. Yeah, Michael's been there. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate it. Thank you.